Welcome, my tired scholars. Settle into your high-backed chairs. Breathe in the musty scent of old paper and cedarwood oil, and let the soft rustle of turning pages and distant rain against Carter Hall's stone windows lull you into a quiet state of mind. Tonight's lecture will unfold not with urgency, but with the slow grace of a shadow crossing the forest floor, a forgotten tale whispered through pines and carried by wind across sand and time. Our subject this evening is a mystery older than the United States itself, a silence in the record, a question written in the margins of history. We shall examine the enigmatic fate of the Lost Colony of Roanoke. Imagine, if you will, the year 1587. A group of English settlers, weary and sea-worn, disembark upon a sandy shores of an island just off the coast of what we now call North Carolina. These were not merely explorers, they were planters, craftsmen, women with infants in their arms. They came not just to survive, but to build a New England from the wilderness. But when a relief party arrived 3 years later, the settlement was gone. No graves, no struggle, no final message, only a word carved into a tree, Croatan. We shall examine the details, what is known, what is theorized, and what is left to darker speculation. We shall walk through their daily life, trace the steps of Governor John White, and explore the theories that have tried and failed to explain the silence. Perhaps, as students of Miskatonic, you may begin to sense that history often leaves things out not because they are unknown, but because they are too terrible to name. There are ancient things buried in the American soil, some of them bones, some of them older. But before we begin in earnest, if you are listening from afar, whether beneath blankets or beside candlelight, please remember to mark your attendance with a like. Subscribe to attend future lectures within the arcane halls of Miskatonic. And as always, leave your notes, your time, your location, or your reflections in the comments archived below. Let us now return to the 16th century, to brackish waters and tangled forests, to the flicker of lanterns and the echo of drums. Let us begin with the rhythm of their lives.
The colonists' small fleet had made its final crossing. The sea, as ever, was gray and restless behind them. The land ahead still and expectant. Roanoke Island, nestled between the Atlantic Ocean and the Albemarle Sound, was long and narrow, some 12 miles in length, its shores thick with salt grass and towering loblolly pines. Its air was different from England, warmer, more humid, scented not with coal smoke and wet stone, but with brine, crushed reeds, and the occasional sweetness of honeysuckle. The colonists disembarked with little fanfare. Their boots sank into damp sand, and their hands were calloused from months at sea. Many were unwell. Scurvy, fever, and the rawness of long confinement clung to them. But they had come with purpose. This was to be not a brief outpost, but a new beginning. To the south stretched the wilderness, thick woods haunted by cries unfamiliar to the English ear. Birds, yes, but stranger sounds as well. Tones that fell between bird call and voice. And in the undergrowth, patterns carved into bark that no one claimed to recognize. The Algonquian-speaking peoples had lived in this place for generations, and their presence was felt immediately, though rarely seen at first. The colonists began slowly to establish themselves. With no time for elegance, their structures were crude, timber-framed, daubed with mud, thatched when supplies allowed. The remnants of a previous failed expedition still lingered on the island. A few broken fences, an abandoned fort, and overgrown plots once tilled in desperation. These were repurposed with quiet efficiency. Roanoke was not their first attempt, and would not, so they believed, be their last. They named the settlement the City of Raleigh, after their patron. But the land did not care for such names. The trees bent the wind in ways not charted on any English map, and shadows pooled quickly in the underbrush. The colonists kept to their tasks, but some among them whispered at night that they felt watched. Still, they pressed on. They built, they planted, they tried to dream. And yet the land remained distant, unmoved, as though it remembered something, or waited.
By the second week, the rhythm of colonial life began to take shape, not through plan or decree, but by the quiet coercion of necessity. The wilderness did not allow for idleness. Every waking hour had to be spent in labor, observation, or endurance. Each colonist found their place by demand rather than desire. The men cut timber, cleared brush, dug post holes into reluctant soil. Some fished the shallows with crude nets or sharpened spears, drawing silver flickers from waters brackish and still. Others trapped hares or searched the forest floor for edible roots, their findings always uncertain. There was no bounty here, only the slow yielding of reluctant ground. The women and children worked no less. They tended fires, mixed mud with straw, fashioned cloth from imported boats, and stewed what little meat was caught with beans and maize, obtained through bartered goodwill. Water was hauled in heavy pails from shallow wells or nearby streams, always boiled, always scarce. The soil gave nothing freely. Even small gardens struggled, beset by insects, and shaded by trees that seemed to lean just slightly inward over every cleared patch. Illness, too, came quietly. The air was thick and the seasons sharp. Malarial fever settled into joints and lungs with no warning. At dawn, the strongest hands might labor in the fields. By dusk, those same hands trembled beside a smoky fire, eyes glazed and skin cold to the touch. The dead were buried in haste, without ceremony, often in shallow graves along the forest's edge. There were no stone markers, just mounds, slowly reclaimed by moss and pine needles. And yet, despite this hardship, there was structure. Morning began with the bell, rung not by clock, but by habit. Meals were simple and irregular, but shared. Children played, though always within sight. Tools were mended by hand, clothes repaired until threadbare. The colonists recorded, counted, measured. They believed that order might prevail if written down. Governor John White, when still among them, kept a ledger. He noted wind direction, daily labor, the state of the maize. It was his way of holding back the wild, of keeping England alive on foreign soil. But there were things that did not enter his pages. The settlers sometimes spoke of dreams, strange ones, of impossible music heard at night, echoing faintly from the tree line, of shapes glimpsed across the marsh, tall and unmoving, seen only in twilight, of stones that did not seem native to the island, carved with sigils no one could trace. These things were never formally acknowledged. They passed from mouth to ear in quiet murmurs, shared only when the children were asleep and the night was long. Still the work continued. There was no time for fear. They had crossed an ocean to begin again, and they would not turn back. The English colonists did not arrive to an empty land. Roanoke and the greater coastal region around it was home to many native peoples, Algonquian-speaking societies whose roots in the region ran far deeper than the shallow furrows carved by English hoes. To the colonists they were a curiosity. To the native peoples they were an uncertainty, neither friend nor foe, but a ripple in the rhythm of the land. The most direct early contact came through the Croatan, a small group believed to live on nearby Hatteras Island. They were skilled fishers and cultivators, with complex kinship ties to other tribes inland. Early interpreters, most notably Monteo and Wanchese, who had traveled to England before, attempted to bridge the vast space between world views. But even when words could be exchanged, meanings often could not. The colonists traded for maize, tobacco, and fish. In return, they offered metal tools, glass beads, and woven cloth, trinkets by native standards, yet strange enough to warrant temporary goodwill. For a time there was peace, if only because neither side could afford war. But misunderstandings festered like wounds. A missing silver cup sparked one of the earliest clashes. Accusation followed accusation, and the colonists, unfamiliar with the politics of reciprocity and insult among native groups, often responded with aggression. Entire villages were burned in punitive acts, actions that deepened a rift no amount of tobacco or trinkets could mend. Even so, there were moments, quiet ones, of mutual observation. The colonists watched in awe as native canoes slipped silently through the reeds. They marveled at crops planted in harmonious clusters, corn, beans, and squash growing together as though in communion. And they recorded strange rites conducted under moonlight, chanting, smoke, firelight flickering over painted faces. White's sketches of these rituals survive, but his explanations do not. The natives, too, watched the settlers. They noted their sicknesses, their hunger, their heavy boots that bruised the ground. They saw how often the strangers looked to the sky, as if asking for guidance that would not come. They saw their fortifications, their iron tools, their fear. There are suggestions, thin, spectral, of deeper knowledge. The Croatan, according to fragments of oral history, may have spoken of the island as touched, not cursed precisely, but marked, a place where certain things had once happened, or might yet still do, that should not be named. They avoided certain groves. They warned against drawing water from particular pools, and they watched, always watched, from the edges of the forest. The colonists believed they were alone. They were not. If the days were shaped by labor, The nights belonged to silence. As twilight fell, the settlement's activities dimmed. Fires were banked low, lanterns lit with care, and crude shutters closed against the salt-heavy breeze. The sounds of axes and shovels gave way to murmured voices, the occasional cry of a restless child, and the far-off rustle of wind through trees whose names the settlers did not know. Night was not an absence, but a present. It arrived slowly, like fog moving in over the water, cool, wet, and oddly heavy. The island transformed in the dark. Paths seemed longer, trees leaned closer, familiar tools cast unfamiliar shadows, and the flicker of firelight gave even the most mundane shapes a strange and spectral character. For the children, sleep often came in uneasy fits. Some muttered in their dreams, others sat bolt upright at odd hours, their eyes wide with a fear they could not explain. Mothers soothed them with lullabies, their melodies carried faintly into the night, only to be answered, it was sometimes whispered, by echoes too perfectly timed to be coincidence. The men kept watch in pairs, walking slow circuits around the palisade with torches in hand. They rarely spoke, for what was there to say? The forest pressed against the edges of their meagre light. Beyond it stretched the marshes, and beyond that, the sea. Isolation did not come only from distance, it came from the land itself, which seemed to resist their presence like a body rejecting a graft. Some settlers began to complain of dreams, of distant bells, not quite English in tone, of vast stone ruins glimpsed in impossible detail, of strange stars visible only from their beds, seen through ceilings that should have blocked any sky. These stories were never written down. They were shared softly, as if speaking them aloud might summon whatever lay behind them. John White, before his departure, often walked alone in the late hours. He claimed it helped him think, but others watched him from afar and noted that he sometimes paused at the edge of the forest, gazing into the trees with a peculiar stillness. One night he returned with a page torn from his sketchbook, the ink smeared and wet. He did not say what it had shown, only that it was better removed. And still the nights passed. There was no church bell to mark the hours, only the steady rhythm of insects, the lapping of waves on the shore, and the occasional thump of something unseen brushing against the outer wall, too heavy for a deer, too slow for a man. In the journals that survive, these things are not mentioned, but they are felt between the lines. The colony survived the night, then the next, then another. But the silence, once it found them, never truly left. Before Roanoke became a mystery, it was a vision. And that vision bore the quiet signature of a man named John White. John White was not a conqueror nor a soldier. He was, by trade and temperament, a painter, an observer of the natural world. In the years before the colony, he travelled alongside earlier English expeditions as a cartographer and chronicler, recording the topography of the New World in careful, delicate strokes. His watercolours still survive in English archives, renderings of flora, fauna, and native people, executed with an eye not only for form, but for dignity. He saw detail where others saw opportunity. When Sir Walter Raleigh appointed White to govern the Roanoke colony, it was a curious choice. He was not a nobleman, nor a hardened veteran. He had little experience with command. And yet perhaps it was his very caution, his patience, his sense of wonder, that made him seem fit to oversee such a delicate undertaking. White did not come alone. Among the colonists were his daughter Eleanor Dare and her husband Ananias. Just days after their arrival on Roanoke Island, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. To John White, the moment must have felt like an augury, a promise written in the cries of a newborn that a New England could, indeed, take root in the soil of this vast continent. But visions rarely survive contact with reality. From the beginning, the colony faced hardship, dwindling supplies, faltering trade with native tribes, a growing sense that the island itself resisted their presence. White made efforts to maintain order, but the settlers grew restless. It was decided that he would return to England to plead for aid. He resisted the idea at first, but there were none better suited to make the case. And so, with anguish in his heart, White departed, leaving his daughter, his granddaughter, and over 100 settlers behind. He intended to return within months. The voyage, though perilous, was routine. He had no reason to think he would be gone for long. But history, like tide and time, has little concern for intention. White's ship vanished into the horizon, and the colony he left behind, his colony, would pass into legend. John White intended to return quickly. He had no wish to linger in London's tangle of fog and politics, not when his daughter and granddaughter waited across an ocean. But the world in the year 1587 was not given to mercy or to speed. No sooner had White arrived in England than the sky darkened with war. The threat of the Spanish Armada loomed over the Channel. Every ship that could float was pressed into service by the Crown. Private ventures, no matter how urgent, were laid aside for Queen and country. White pleaded. He wrote letters to Raleigh. He offered his knowledge, his navigational skill, even his connections to the Virginia Company. But the seas were no longer his to cross. Months passed, then a year. Ships were seized, supplies redirected, plans abandoned. White wandered the docks, watching as vessels prepared for war while his colony starved across the sea. It is said that he kept a diary during this time, though only fragments remain. One note reads, "I dream of the island with such clarity that I taste the salt on the wind, yet I wake to soot and silence." Another passage, more cryptic, reads simply, "The trees are not empty, they never were." By the year 1590, the threat of invasion had waned enough to allow a voyage. White secured passage aboard a small fleet, privateers more interested in Spanish treasure than colonial welfare. But he would take what he could get. With a heart hollowed by years of waiting, he set sail once more for Roanoke. The crossing was difficult. Storms battered the ships. Tempers flared among the crew. At least one vessel turned back, damaged beyond repair. Yet White pressed on, driven by something deeper than duty, a need not merely to return, but to know. 3 years had passed, 3 years of silence. When Roanoke Island finally appeared on the horizon, cloaked in gray morning mist, White's hands trembled. He would find no smoke rising from hearths, no children playing near the water's edge, no familiar figures waving from the clearing. The place was still, too still. The longboats pushed ashore with barely a sound, their oars slicing the water like slow, deliberate strokes of ink across paper. John White stepped onto the sand of Roanoke Island again after 3 long years, his boots pressing into the same ground he had once called the edge of England. But now there was no sound of welcome. No one came to meet them. The path to the settlement was still there, though overgrown. Vines curled across once cleared trails. Brambles clung to the edges of the palisade. The very forest seemed to have grown a little closer, as if reclaiming what it had always been its own. White passed through the gate, weathered but intact. The houses stood where he remembered them, but they were empty. Not ruined, not burned, simply absent of life. There were no graves, no blood, no scattered belongings. Even the iron tools, the cooking pots, the simple comforts of colonial living, gone. Only the structures remained, stripped clean, as if carefully vacated rather than destroyed. And then he saw it. Carved into one of the palisade's sturdy beams, clear and deliberate, Croatoan. It was not a word of English origin, but one White recognized. It referred to a nearby island south of Roanoke, inhabited by a native group with whom the settlers had once held fragile if cordial relations. There was no accompanying sign of distress, no cross or mark of danger, as had been agreed upon before his departure. The carving was neat, even confident. On a nearby tree, another partial carving, CRO. Some have suggested it was the beginning of a second attempt, interrupted mid-effort. Others see it as a marker, incomplete and ominous. Whatever its intent, it offered no clarity, only conjecture. White searched the area for days. They explored inland, traced paths toward the coast, shouted into the trees. No fires were found, no bones, no traces. The settlement was gone in its entirety, as though removed, not by violence, but by a quiet and total unraveling. It was not the devastation that haunted him, it was the order. The colonists had not fled in chaos. They had departed deliberately, with all their tools, all their belongings, and without leaving behind even the echo of their final footsteps. White intended to sail to Croatoan Island next, but a storm rose, sudden, sharp, and cruel. The sailors refused to continue. Supplies ran low, the season turned, and so, with a heart heavier than he left, White returned to England. He never saw his daughter again. He never saw Virginia, and though he lived for many years after, he never returned to America. In his final writings, he refers to the colony only as the Silence. In the wake of John White's return to England, bereft of answers but burdened with questions, the fate of the Roanoke colonists passed from a matter of logistics to one of legend. Raleigh, still entangled in his own political ambitions, made little public comment. The colony, once his proud endeavor, became a quiet embarrassment. Funds dried up. Expeditions were postponed. Official inquiry gave way to silence. But rumors did not. Even in White's lifetime, speculation bloomed. Some believed the colonists had joined the Croatoan people willingly, intermarrying and adopting their customs. Others feared a massacre, whether at the hands of neighboring tribes or less tangible forces. The neatness of the site, the absence of violence, troubled many. If blood had been spilled, why not a single sign? Years later, in the early 1700s, English traders along the Carolina coast would report occasional sightings of indigenous people with gray eyes and fair hair, physical traits that sparked a renewal of theory. Could the English bloodline have survived, diluted into memory, hidden among reeds and smoke? And then there were the stranger accounts. A sailor claimed to have found a village far inland where the locals spoke broken Elizabethan English. Another insisted he had seen wooden crosses carved with Latin phrases deep in the swamps. A few whispered that a curse had followed the colonists from England, that they had desecrated something sacred upon the island and been swallowed whole in return. No evidence emerged to confirm any of these tales, but neither did anything emerge to dispel them. In time, the colony became a lesson rather than an inquiry, a cautionary tale about distance, mismanagement, and the cruel indifference of the wild. The name Roanoke faded from imperial documents, replaced by more successful settlements to the north and south. But even so, the disappearance echoed. In certain halls, in places like this one, the matter was never fully closed. Among the restricted holdings of Miskatonic University are letters bound in oilskin attributed to a sailor from White's second voyage. They are brittle with age and water damage. Most are illegible. But on one page, written in a tight, uncertain hand, is a phrase that does not appear in any known dialect. The place is thin, not gone, but folded. Whatever the sailor meant, he did not explain. No further writings exist. He died at sea before reaching port. And so the questions remain. Why was the colony emptied so cleanly? Why was Croatoan left behind and nothing else? And what, if anything, did Roanoke awaken? In the absence of written records, we turn, as scholars often must, to the spoken word, the story, the voice passed from generation to generation like a fragile candle in the dark. Among the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Outer Banks and inland woodlands, there survive fragments of oral tradition, some tangled with colonial memory, others perhaps far older. These stories speak in guarded tones of pale-faced settlers who came, struggled, and vanished, but not without a trace. One such account, recorded centuries later by colonial intermediaries, described a group of Englishmen who took shelter with the Croatan, adopting their ways, learning their language, and living as kin. In these tellings, the newcomers were not conquerors, but wayfarers, weathered by sea, lost by their own kind, and accepted only through great humility. Some stories go further.
They suggest that not all who came were taken in, that a group split off, perhaps by choice, perhaps by force, and journeyed deep into the forest, past the familiar rivers, into a place where the world does not move forward. In that place, the sky was wrong, the wind spoke in syllables, and those who entered did not return. It is important, of course, to exercise care with such accounts. Oral traditions are shaped by time, interpretation, and translation. When English chroniclers, whose motives were rarely neutral, recorded these stories, they did so through the filter of their own mythologies. The white Indians of later colonial law were often less an acknowledgment of actual survivors and more a projection of guilt, of wonder, of empire's unfinished questions. And yet, the consistency of certain details gives pause. In multiple regions of coastal Carolina, different tribes spoke of an old settlement where trees grew in a perfect circle, where no birds nested, and where stones with foreign markings lay half buried in the loam. These places were avoided. Children were warned not to play near them, and in certain seasons, it was said, the air grew thick, not with heat, but with memory. Some elders referred to these places as listy chalk, or spirit sunk, not haunted precisely, but somehow submerged, as if beneath the surface of this world lay another, older one. It would be easy to dismiss such phrases as metaphor, and perhaps they are. But among the elders of Miskatonic's anthropology department, whose notes rarely see public light, a quiet consensus persists that the indigenous peoples of the Roanoke region remembered more than they were ever asked, that beneath the confusion and colonial mistranslation there lies something persistent, not a solution, but a warning. In the 1930s, more than 3 centuries after the Roanoke colony vanished into the fog of time, a stone was found beside a Carolina roadway, a rough, heavy thing, bearing an inscription in Old English script. The message, crudely carved, claimed to be from Eleanor Dare, daughter of Governor John White. It spoke of loss, of hardship, of a desperate migration inland. It named the year 1591, and it ended with a grim catalogue of death. "Only 7 are safe. Father, soon I go to him," it read. It was signed E.W.D. The stone stirred sudden and intense interest. Scholars debated its language and phrasing. Newspapers seized upon the mystery. Soon other stones appeared, over 40 in total, each offering fragments of a larger tragic saga, of conflict with native tribes, of wandering, of hope turned to ash. For a brief time, it seemed as though the great mystery of Roanoke had been solved. At last, a voice had emerged from the silence. But skepticism followed swiftly. The language on the later stones bore signs of modern construction. The carving style varied strangely, and the locations where they were found along highways and accessible paths raised suspicions. A scholar at Emory University, tasked with analyzing them, noted inconsistencies in weathering, phrasing, and orthography. Eventually, most were dismissed as deliberate forgeries, products of opportunists seeking attention, or perhaps money,
in a time of economic despair. Only the first stone, the original Elinodare tablet, retained a measure of plausibility. Its language was less theatrical, its surface more aged, its discovery less contrived. And yet no consensus has ever been reached. It sits now in relative obscurity, neither wholly embraced nor entirely rejected. The Dare Stones became in the end a story about stories, about the deep human need to explain the inexplicable, to impose narrative upon silence, and perhaps about how that silence resists. Among Miskatonic's faculty, the stones are occasionally referenced, not as evidence, but as artifacts of longing. The longing to reach through time, to hear a mother's voice across centuries, to believe, if only for a moment, that someone left behind a message. Even if the stones were carved by liars, the hope they inspired was real. But hope, as we know in these halls, is often the softest veil over something much older and much colder beneath. The earth remembers what we forget. Though wind and weather may wear away the surface of time, the ground beneath our feet keeps record, quiet, partial, and often unwilling to yield. Beginning in the early 20th century and continuing through the present day, archaeologists have returned to Roanoke Island with shovels, sieves, and soft brushes, hoping to answer with science what history left blank. They excavated the original settlement site, now long overtaken by forest. There, among roots and layers of shifting soil, they found only fragments, a rustic nail, a piece of early English pottery, the glaze faded, charred wood from a long-decayed palisade, no mass graves, no stockpiles, nothing to confirm flight, nor massacre, nor migration. Attention soon shifted to nearby Hatteras Island, once called Croatoan, where members of the original native population were known to have lived. Here, finds were more plentiful, tools of both native and European origin, a slate writing tablet bearing faint traces of the letter M, a broken sword hilt unmistakably English in design, evidence perhaps of integration, or at the very least of contact. But evidence is not story, and each artifact raised more questions than it answered. Were these items traded or carried by survivors? Were they signs of peaceful assimilation or silent conquest? The absence of fortifications, the presence of domestic tools, all suggested a settled life. But whose? Some teams have searched further inland, chasing reports of light-skinned descendants or villages with architectural anomalies. These expeditions, though sincere, have found little that could not be explained through later colonial contact. And always, always, the evidence thins as the trees grow thicker. More recently, satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have been employed to trace lost structures beneath the soil. These efforts have revealed unusual depressions, rectangular voids suggestive of long-gone buildings. Yet excavation is slow, funding sporadic, and the land reluctant to give up its dead. And so the archaeologists return each season, lifting small pieces from the ground, buttons, beads, nails, like clues from a vanished dream. They catalogue, preserve, hypothesize, but they do not claim certainty.
They speak instead in careful language, likely, possibly, suggests. Because the truth of Roanoke may not lie buried, it may lie folded between what can be touched and what cannot be seen. Among Miskatonic's own field reports, kept under restricted access, is one document filed decades ago regarding an excavation led by alumni in the Dismal Swamp region. It claims the discovery of a stone ring, perfectly symmetrical, untouched by lichen, and etched with markings not found in any colonial record. The stone was reportedly warm to the touch even in winter. The report ends abruptly. The lead archaeologist never submitted a final summary. The site has since been lost to rising water. In the most private corridors of historical study, those unlit by grant money or public inquiry, there are questions that do not seek answers, only acknowledgement. Roanoke, to the mainstream scholar, is a tale of failed colonial logistics, of underprepared settlers and strained alliances. But within the older archives of Miskatonic, behind key and candle, lie stranger interpretations. Not declarations, never that, only suggestions, curiosities filed under inconclusive phenomena, or field notes withheld by request. These documents speak softly of liminality. They describe Roanoke not merely as a vanished colony, but as a thin place, a region where the membrane between worlds is worn and frayed. A cartographer in 1603 sketched the island's outline 3 times in a single journal, each tracing slightly different. When asked to explain, he replied, "It moves when I look away." An early botanist studying local plant life noted species that did not match any classification from either Europe or the Americas. Fungi with spiraled stalks and blossoms that closed in moonlight rather than sun. None were preserved. When pressed, he claimed they had dissolved in their jars. Others whispered they simply walked away. In one case, rarely cited even in restricted archives, a solitary letter was found tucked into a copy of Hakluyt's Principal Navigations in Miskatonic's library basement. It was unsigned, written in copper ink. It read, "The island is not lost. It is submerged, not beneath water, but underneath time. The trees do not grow from soil, but from memory. We should not dig there." The handwriting is erratic but elegant. No source has ever been confirmed. To be clear, none of this constitutes proof. These are not facts to be cited in lecture halls outside these walls, but they endure, because history, like the sea, is not only shaped by what it reveals, but by what it withholds. There is a school of thought, never formalized, but whispered among certain scholars late in the evening, that Roanoke's disappearance was not an event, but an exchange, that something was given, perhaps unknowingly, in return for knowledge, power, or escape, and that what was received could not be borne. Some speculate that the colonists found something, an artifact, a stone, a language, and followed it inward.
not across land, but into the folds of existence, into a place with no horizon and no return. A dimensional cusp, a soft spot in the world, a threshold. The word Croatone itself may not be a destination, but a description, a cipher, a warning. If so, it was not heeded. And if Roanoke truly disappeared into such a place, then perhaps it was not lost, but kept, not destroyed, but archived, like all things that are found by forces beyond naming. To understand what Roanoke meant to its colonists, we must briefly return to the world they left behind, a land not of silence and fog, but of hierarchy, ambition, and order. England, in the late 16th century, was a realm of intricate structure and mounting dreams. The Elizabethan court gleamed with poetry and pageantry, but it rested atop a bedrock of struggle and fear. The cities were dense with life, chimneys belching soot into the sky, streets crowded with merchants, apprentices, and beggars. Disease moved hand in hand with commerce. The plague came and went like a ghostly tide, thinning neighborhoods and leaving behind a silence few dared name. Yet for all its peril, England pulsed with purpose. It was the age of Raleigh, of Drake, of Shakespeare, of grand voyages, whispered heresies, and the first breaths of empire. London was swelling. Nobles plotted investments from oak-panelled halls, while scribes inked charters to distant lands they had never seen. And somewhere among them, the Roanoke colony was imagined. It was not a humanitarian endeavor. It was a venture, a projection of wealth, power, and control. For Sir Walter Raleigh and his courtly peers, the New World was a canvas upon which they could draw England anew. Not merely fields and farms, but a reflection of order itself. Civilization where there had been none, faith where they found difference, flags planted where forests reigned. But none of these men intended to settle the place themselves. They sent others, the expendable, the hopeful, the poor, craftsmen, farmers, debtors, adventurers, people with little to lose and dreams they could not afford to chase at home. The elites stayed behind, sipping wine, reading reports, and waiting for profit. Even John White, the colony's governor, though gentle of spirit, had moved in those circles. His art, his charts, his very appointment had all been touched by noble hands. And so when he departed England to found Roanoke, he carried not only his own hopes, but the burden of theirs. The colony in the eyes of the elite was a symbol, a foothold, an extension of empire into wildness. But wildness does not bow easily, and the New World did not care for English dreams. In Elizabethan England, the New World shimmered in the minds of the ambitious like a mirage, glimmering gold in the trees, fountains of youth beneath the hills, vast plains ready for the plough, and docile peoples waiting only to be ruled. This fantasy, woven from sailors' tales, merchants' boasts, and courtly speculation, was deeply seductive.
Maps were drawn with more imagination than information, depicting empty coastlines marked with Latin names and little sea monsters to remind readers of the edge of the known world. Pamphlets circulated in London, promising endless harvests and exotic riches. Writers and poets, eager to please their noble patrons, described the New World not as it was, but as it ought to be, fertile, tame, and eager. And yet, those who made the crossing found something quite different. They found dense forests that swallowed light by midday, marshes that bred fever, storms that broke ships like toys, languages they could not decipher, and customs they could not comprehend. Most unsettling of all, they found a land that did not respond to order. Fields would not yield, forts would not stand, relationships could not be forced into neat hierarchies. Even time itself seemed to bend in unfamiliar ways, with seasons that did not align with the rhythms they had known. The colonists of Roanoke were sent to impose civilization, but how does one impose a grid upon a place that has no use for lines? They tried. They built stockades and gave them Latin names. They assigned roles, held meetings, drew maps. But the island was not a stage, and it would not perform. In truth, the fantasy of empire had never been meant for the soil. It was always meant for those who stayed behind. For the lords and financiers in London, it was not the reality of Roanoke that mattered. It was the idea of Roanoke, the illusion of control, of extension, of permanence. And when the illusion failed, when the colony vanished, quiet and complete, there was little appetite to retrieve the truth. Raleigh, fearing political embarrassment, did not fund further expeditions. White, broken, and adrift, was left to drift into obscurity. The mystery was left to settle like silt over forgotten stone. For those in power, the loss of Roanoke was not a tragedy. It was a footnote. But for those who disappeared, it was everything. The colonists had brought with them everything they thought would tame the land: tools, maps, seeds, scripture. But they underestimated something far more powerful than the unknown: indifference. Nature on Roanoke Island was not hostile in the way war is hostile. It did not rise against them in sudden violence. It simply did not care. The trees grew where they pleased. The storms arrived without warning. The soil yielded or it did not, with no regard for prayers or preparation. Even the birds and insects seemed to come and go according to rhythms the colonists could not decipher. Back in England, lines were drawn on charts and property deeds. Possession was a matter of ink and seal. But here the land belonged to no one. It answered to no crown, no charter, no creed. When they tried to raise fences, vines crept in. When they built palisades, the ground shifted beneath them. When they dug wells, salt leached up from the earth. In the letters and journals that survive, one finds not declarations of triumph, but notes of quiet fatigue. Our men tire quickly. The air does not lift. We hear voices in the trees.
These are not the cries of conquerors, but the slow admissions of those who have begun to understand that they are not in command. And even among the colonists themselves, the old social orders began to falter. Rank meant little when food was short and labor was constant. A gentleman with calloused hands was a contradiction in England. In Roanoke, he was simply hungry. Governor White's authority, while respected in theory, often eroded in practice. Survival has a way of simplifying things. In the broader sweep of empire, the English would eventually return and carve new settlements into the land, some enduring, others abandoned. But Roanoke remains distinct, not because it failed, but because it disappeared. It did not burn. It did not fall. It slipped quietly, completely, out of the reach of those who thought themselves masters. It is easy to imagine that the colony was simply overwhelmed by sickness, by storm, by tension with the native tribes. But the truth may be deeper and colder than that. Roanoke was not destroyed. It was unacknowledged by the world it had hoped to join, like a single candle extinguished in a storm. In the centuries since Roanoke faded into silence, the word lost has adhered to it like lichen to stone. It has become more than a location. It is a metaphor, a ghost in the national memory, a wound that never quite bled, yet never fully closed. The disappearance of the colony lingered, not because of what was found, but because of what was not. The absence became the story, and in that vacuum every generation has poured its fears, its longings, its myths. The settlers became symbols of innocence, of hubris, of colonial tragedy, of spiritual punishment, depending on the teller. Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil, was later imagined as a pale phantom wandering the forests, or as a wild spirit raised by wolves, or even as a guardian of American virtue. None of these tales are historical, but they reveal something deeper than fact, the need to explain. For those who seek tidy narratives, Roanoke is a frustration. For those who dwell in the margins of history, the uncertain, the unnamed, it is a lodestone. The very silence invites curiosity, and where curiosity lingers long enough, legend follows. Even in modern times, Roanoke casts its long shadow. The name appears in television scripts, horror anthologies, and speculative essays. Archaeologists return to the site each season. Documentaries are filmed. New technologies are turned upon old soil. But for all the effort, the mystery endures. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps Roanoke was not meant to be solved. Perhaps its true lesson is not about colonial ambition or native relations or even survival, but about humility, a reminder that there are still places, still stories that resist the grasp of reason. At Miskatonic, we often speak of thresholds, of doors between what is and what cannot be spoken. Roanoke, it seems, is such a door, and though many have knocked upon it, none have passed through, or if they have not returned. And so we come, dear students, to the end of this evening's quiet descent through forest and salt marsh, through ledger and law, through what was left behind and what was never found. The Lost Colony of Roanoke remains, in every sense, unresolved. Its footprints have long since faded, its voices stilled. Yet its absence continues to echo, not just through history books and lectures, but through the deeper layers of our curiosity, that quiet wondering, where did they go? Perhaps they were taken in by kindred hands. Perhaps they perished, nameless and unmarked, in the thickets of an uncaring land. Or perhaps, just perhaps, they crossed some unseen threshold, not of space, but of perception, into a realm that does not answer when called. In the safety of your present, your warm lamplit room, your gentle breathing, the soft hum of the world continuing without crisis, consider this. The people of Roanoke were once just as present, just as alive. They woke to gulls crying, to the ache of labor, to the fragile hopes of another day. And then they were gone. Not erased, but withheld. We may never know what happened to them, but we may remember this, that the unknown is not always to be feared, nor always to be solved. Sometimes it is to be respected, allowed to rest, like the hush between tides, or the moment just before dreaming takes hold. And with that, let us gently close our books for tonight. The lanterns are low, the hour is late. Mark your attendance with a like if you have not yet done so. Subscribe to attend future lectures in Carter Hall, and leave your notes below, your thoughts, your time, your place in this wondering world. Sleep well, scholars. May your dreams remain on this side of the veil.